For men, you do not belong here. Go check with catering and make sure the coffee is hot. My father said those words loud enough for every executive in the hallway to hear. Then he closed the door in my face. Not slammed, just shut with the kind of absolute certainty that did not expect or allow a response. I stood there with folders pressed against my chest, the ones I had spent all night preparing. Inside were financial projections, risk assessments, and operational frameworks that would have answered every question the board was about to fumble through. I had placed tabs exactly where I knew they would need guidance. I had written notes in the margins, brief and calm and irrefutable. I had learned long ago that in this building sounding steady mattered more than being right. The hallway held his words like an echo that refused to fade. Inside the room, chairs scraped lightly. Someone laughed too quickly, papers shuffled, and the meeting began without me, right on time. No one opened the door. No one asked if I was coming. This was not the first door closed in my face. It was just the first one that did it with such public cruelty. A senior vice president passed me without slowing down, his eyes fixed forward, pretending not to see me standing there, holding the very data he would later present as his own. I stepped aside and let the hallway breathe again. I leaned against the wall and counted to 10, not because I was angry, but because a lingering, naive part of me still expected something different. An apology, a glance back, a hand on the handle. Nothing came. I had grown used to this position, adjacent but never central, close enough to contribute, far enough to exclude. For years I told myself it was temporary. I believed that once they saw how much of the company I carried on my back, the distance would shrink. It never did. My brother had a seat at the table by default. He always had, even when he arrived late smelling of expensive bourbon and overconfidence, even when he skimmed documents I had stayed up until dawn correcting. He spoke with a confidence that did not need to be earned because it had been granted at birth. Future leader, my father liked to say, and it sounded less like encouragement than a settled fact. No one ever had to push me out. I was simply placed exactly where they thought I belonged, and they waited for me to stay there. I did. For a while. Officially, I handled office operations and internal coordination. In practice, I was the ghostwriter for their successes. I did not attend board meetings. I did not vote on strategy. But I knew exactly where the bottlenecks were, who depended on whose approval, and where the vulnerabilities hid. I was not powerful. I was informed. And that distinction was a weapon they did not realize I was holding. A week earlier, the turning point had not felt dramatic. There was no cinematic buildup. Just a late afternoon in a small, cramped office I had walked past 1,000 times. The blinds were half open, light falling unevenly across the desk. Someone slid a stack of legal documents toward me and said, "We need your signature here for the audit. Not your review, not your thoughts, just a signature." I read every page slowly. I did not do it because I suspected a trap. I did it because being overlooked had taught me that the fine print is where they hide the truth. There was no spark of triumph when I saw the clause, the one that triggered the succession rights my grandfather had embedded in the family trust decades ago. It was just a quiet understanding. This was not a promotion. It was a reclaiming. The clause was specific. Upon my 30th birthday, if I held an active role within the company and signed the annual trust acknowledgement, voting control of the primary shares would transfer to me automatically. My grandfather had written it as protection against exactly the kind of favoritism my father practiced. He had watched his own sons sideline their sisters and wanted to ensure it would not happen again. My father and brother had treated these documents as routine tax filings for years. They never thought I would actually read the fine print. I signed where I was told, handed the papers back, and did not say a word. Not because I was hiding, but because they would not have listened anyway. Back in the present, I returned to my desk after the meeting began without me. The office hummed with its usual mechanical indifference. Phones rang, emails stacked up, and a manager asked if I could just take a look at a budget discrepancy that had been unresolved for days. No one mentioned the meeting. No one asked why I was standing in the hallway. The company moved forward on momentum, never bothered by reflection. I was midway through a compliance report when I sensed someone approaching. Not with a casual stroll, but with the frantic energy of someone whose world had just tilted. The junior clerk stopped just short of my desk, her face pale. "Ma'am," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you need to see the internal server. Now." She turned her screen toward me. I did not read the text right away. I did not have to. I could feel the atmosphere in the office shift the way the air thins right before a storm. Inside the boardroom, voices rose. Chairs were thrown back. And for the first time in 30 years, someone said my name. Not as a daughter, not as support, as the owner. They thought shutting the door ended the conversation. They were wrong. It only gave me time to prepare. I did not knock. I just waited for them to realize the locks had already changed. I did not look at the screen right away. When the junior clerk said I needed to see something, I asked her for a minute. Just one. She nodded and stepped back, leaving me alone with a quiet I had learned not to fear. Silence had never meant absence to me. It meant space, time to think, time to decide which version of myself would walk into the next moment. People often ask why I didn't fight earlier. They imagine resistance as something loud and visible, raised voices, slammed doors, dramatic exits. But in a family business, survival depends on a different skill entirely. Knowing when not to speak, knowing how to stay useful. That lesson started long before I had a desk or a title. I remember a family dinner years ago. My brother was mid-sentence confident, animated, explaining a real estate trend he'd skimmed that morning. The adults leaned in, nodding, impressed by the certainty in his voice. When I added a zoning detail, something factual, something that could have cost us millions if ignored, my father didn't even look at me. "Don't interrupt," he said calmly. "Listen to your brother. He's looking at the big picture. No anger, no shouting, just a clean dismissal." That was the year I learned something important. Approval wasn't earned by being right. It was granted by position. When I joined the company after business school, I told myself the support role was temporary. Everyone starts somewhere. I worked hard, stayed late, solved problems before they became visible. What I didn't understand then was that competence in the wrong system doesn't elevate you, it fixes you in place. I built frameworks. I connected departments. I corrected errors quietly so meetings could run smoothly. During one board presentation, my brother walked through projections I had spent weeks refining. When a director asked for a breakdown, he glanced at me just for a second. I gave him the answer. He took the credit. Later, someone called me the backbone of the office. They meant it kindly, but backbones aren't meant to be seen. The thought of leaving came one Tuesday night. I sat at my desk with an email draft open addressed to a competitor I knew well. The message was short, professional, unfinished. All it needed was one sentence and a click. I stared at it longer than I expected to. I didn't send it. Not because I was afraid, because I knew something they didn't. I knew which contracts were being held together by my quiet revisions. I knew which partnerships survived because I softened conversations that never should have been careless to begin with. They didn't need a leader. They needed someone to keep things from collapsing, and that someone was me. To be sure, I tested it. I filed for time off during the peak of a quarterly audit. My father approved it without reading. By the second day, my inbox was full of flagged messages. By the third, my brother called. "The vendor audits are a mess," he said. "I need you to handle this when you're back." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. That was when the fog lifted. They didn't miss me. They missed what I fixed. The realization wasn't painful. It was precise. Power doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it's knowing exactly what breaks when you stop carrying it. After that, I noticed things differently. Meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions announced as conclusions, doors closing softly without explanation. At a family dinner, I raised a concern about a timeline that didn't add up. An uncle laughed gently. "Don't overthink it," he said. "Just keep the calendars clean." Something shifted then. Not anger, clarity. The hope that they might eventually see me as a partner stopped being a variable. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because the system needed me that way. By the end of that week, I didn't feel lighter. I felt steadier. I had stopped waiting for a miracle that was never coming. I still didn't know what I would do with that clarity, only that stepping back had shown me something important. There were things they assumed no one would ever look at closely. and for the first time I was ready to start looking. Nothing about that day suggested it would matter. It began the way most of my days did, quiet, procedural, unremarkable. I sat at my desk reviewing documents that had passed through my hands dozens of times before. The work required patience, not urgency. In this company, important things rarely announced themselves. They hid inside routine. People trusted me with details because I had never given them a reason not to. I was digitizing legacy records from before the company migrated to cloud systems, contracts, authorizations, amendments no one else wanted to touch. It was invisible work by design, detail-oriented, reliable, low risk. The access came bundled with assumptions. No one monitored the old server closely. No one imagined I would do more than index and move on. That morning's request was small. A routine comparison prompted by a minor discrepancy in a vendor tax ID that accounting couldn't place. I opened the legacy directory and followed the familiar path. One subfolder caught my attention, not because it looked suspicious, but because it was labeled with an internal code that hadn't been used in years, a catch-all from an earlier system migration. Forgotten, not hidden. I opened it because it was part of the job. Inside were multiple versions of wire transfer authorizations and partnership agreements arranged chronologically without commentary. I didn't feel alarmed. It felt like a habit. I compared dates, checked signature blocks, aligned entity names the way I always did. That was when the first inconsistency surfaced. A date that didn't align with the surrounding approvals. A signature placed where I remembered a different authority being required. Most telling a corporate name that shifted subtly between versions from a known subsidiary to an offshore holding entity with a near-identical name. Not wrong enough to trigger an audit, just wrong enough to move money quietly. I flagged the file and moved on. One inconsistency meant nothing by itself. Documents changed, revisions happened, but the details stayed with me not as panic but as weight. Over the next few days, I returned to the folder under the cover of routine archiving. I traced revisions backward version by version. Patterns emerged slowly. Names present in early drafts disappeared in final executions. Financial responsibility shifted without board resolution. Authority moved without documentation. It wasn't an error, it was a method. I didn't label it wrongdoing. I didn't reach for dramatic language. I didn't need to. The consistency spoke for itself. Changes made carefully over time by people who assumed no one would read closely enough to notice the shape they formed together. I leaned back in my chair, not shocked, not angry, just clear. This was the system I had been navigating all along, built on the assumption that support staff process but do not analyze, that they move paper without memory. I understood then that observation without preparation was a liability. Seeing wasn't enough. So I acted. Not publicly, not emotionally, with restraint. I didn't store anything on the company's shared drive. I saved copies during lunch breaks to my personal laptop, careful not to trigger security alerts. I noted timestamps. I preserved original file paths. I backed everything up to a private cloud account outside the company's routine cleanup cycles. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need answers yet. What I needed was readiness. The work didn't feel like revenge. It felt like insurance. For years, I had absorbed consequences for decisions I didn't make, fixed problems before they surfaced. This time I wasn't angry. I was done being unprotected. By the end of the week, the legacy folder remained exactly where I'd found it. Unchanged, unnoticed, no alarms, no questions. The company moved forward the way it always had, confident, unexamined, unaware. I didn't confront them. I archived them. And for the first time, preparation felt like power. I noticed the shift before anyone named it. It wasn't hostility. It was attention measured, deliberate. I was no longer the unnoticed gear keeping the system moving. I had become a variable. My name started appearing in email threads again, but never as an invitation, never as acknowledgement. They didn't confront me. They adjusted the environment around me. The first move was procedural. I was quietly removed from critical path emails. Meetings that determined direction appeared on calendars only after they had already happened. When I asked about a missing invite, my brother barely looked up from his phone. It was last minute, he said. Nothing strategic. Didn't want to clog your schedule. No one admitted to excluding me. No one acknowledged a pattern. Each omission was framed as courtesy. Together they formed a method. Then the pressure shifted from process to perception. My mother called one evening, her concern carefully practiced. "You sound tense," she said. "Maybe this role is just too much right now." At dinner, my father watched me over the rim of his glass. He didn't disagree with me directly. He didn't need to. My brother filled the space with jokes. "You're overanalyzing again," he said lightly. "It's getting hard to keep up with your anxiety." They never said I was wrong. They suggested I was unstable. The fatigue didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. Being doubted without accusation is more exhausting than being attacked. An attack gives you resistance. This was erosion. The second pressure point came disguised as routine. It was a vendor renewal logistics net 30 terms. I had already flagged the payment window to be revised to net 60 to protect fourth quarter cash flow. The vendor had agreed verbally. I updated the draft in the system and sent a confirmation email. Somewhere between my update and final execution, my revision disappeared. The old version, the one that would strain liquidity at the worst possible moment, was the document that reached final signature. I caught it within the hour and sent a clarification assuming it was a version control issue. 2 days later, a shadow executive summary circulated to the board. My correction was absent. The error was framed as mine, a lapse. Evidence that my attention to detail was slipping. My follow-up email was treated as if it had never existed. They didn't need to invent a failure. They isolated one moment and erased its resolution. Later that week, my father called me into his office. "Maybe your strengths are better suited to support," he said gently. "Leadership requires a different kind of clarity. We just don't want you burning out." I listened. I didn't argue. I recognized the structure. They weren't trying to prove I was incompetent. They were trying to make me tired enough to agree. The final test came wrapped in concern. At Sunday brunch, a relative I had trusted leaned forward. "Have you thought about taking a sabbatical?" he asked. "We could frame it as wellness leave, for the good of the family. Let things settle. In this family, for the good of the family meant removal without confrontation." If I resisted, I was selfish. If I agreed, I disappeared. I didn't respond at the moment. That night I went home and opened my private drive. I stopped reacting and started auditing. I logged metadata from the altered contract user IDs, timestamps, revision paths. I documented every revoked access. Every meeting invite was sent after the meeting ended. Every instance where my correction vanished between draft and execution. Pressure reveals structure. They tried to wear me down quietly. Instead, they showed me exactly where the load-bearing walls were and which ones were already cracking. I was done guessing, done waiting for apologies that would never come. I wasn't fighting back yet. I was preparing. There was no moment of sudden courage, no surge of defiance that announced itself. The change arrived quietly, the way clarity often does after exhaustion has burned away illusion. I woke up one morning and realized I was no longer waiting to be treated fairly. I was deciding how visible I needed to become and to whom. This wasn't rebellion, it was an alignment. The office looked the same when I arrived, same rhythms, same routines, but my relationship to it had shifted. I wasn't scanning faces for approval or bracing for dismissal. I was assessing my position. Waiting to be invited into the room I understood now was a choice, and it was one I no longer planned to make. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted a record. Clarity that could survive scrutiny, documentation that didn't rely on tone or memory. If I waited for permission, nothing would ever be written down. That wasn't bitterness, it was an observation. So I started with the simplest move available to me. I called the right person, not someone inside the family, not someone invested in smoothing things over. I contacted an external attorney who specialized in corporate governance and shareholder exposure, someone I'd been referred to years earlier back when the idea of needing legal counsel felt abstract. The conversation was brief. I didn't explain how I felt. I didn't narrate family history. I sent him a timeline, metadata logs, altered contract drafts, a record of revoked system access. Then I waited. When we spoke again, he didn't rush to reassure me. He read quietly, asked specific questions about signing Authority Version Control Board resolutions. He paused longer than I expected. "This isn't just internal friction," he said carefully. "There's exposure here. Not necessarily intent, but enough inconsistency to matter if anyone outside starts asking questions." He didn't promise outcomes. He didn't talk about winning. He called it groundwork. That word settled in me with more weight than certainty ever could. Groundwork didn't mean resolution. It meant stability. For the first time in weeks, I felt my breathing slow. I wasn't imagining things, and I wasn't carrying them alone anymore. My next move was smaller and riskier. I drafted a short email addressed to Human Resources and the General Counsel. No accusations, no emotional language. Just a request, formal clarification of my role, an updated job description, and a summary of my current signing and decision authorities as reflected in company policy. I referenced the employee handbook section on role definition. I asked for confirmation within 10 business days. I read it twice. Blind copied my attorney, then I sent it. Nothing happened immediately, no reply, no acknowledgement. No. But the air shifted. Conversations paused when I entered the rooms. People looked at me differently, not hostile, just alert. At home, my family avoided the topic entirely. At work, I could feel recalibration happening in real time. They didn't answer, but they adjusted. That silence told me more than a response ever could. Power, I was learning, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation, as a caution, as people reread what they used to skim. I didn't follow up. I didn't clarify. I let the email sit where it was unchanged, unanswered, time-stamped. This wasn't about forcing a reaction. It was about positioning. I had placed a piece on the board and stepped back. Whatever they did next, ignore it, escalate it, or attempt to bury it, would create a record. By the end of the week, nothing had been resolved. But nothing was the same. My first move wasn't loud. It was irreversible. After my formal inquiry to Human Resources went unanswered, nothing exploded. No confrontation followed. No doors slammed. The office settled into a version of calm that almost felt earned. People did their work. Meetings stayed on schedule. At home, conversations drifted toward neutral topics, as if tension were something we could outgrow by simply refusing to name it. I let myself believe the worst of it had passed. There was one person, though. Someone who had never raised their voice, never taken sides loudly, and never treated me like an administrative inconvenience. Her name was Linda Marsh. She was my father's executive assistant, a position she had held for nearly 15 years. She had started at the company the same year I graduated from college, and over time, she had become one of the few constants in an environment defined by shifting alliances and political maneuvering. She knew where every file was stored. She knew which board members needed flattery and which ones responded better to directness. She knew the schedules, the preferences, the unspoken rules that governed how things actually got done. More importantly, she has always been kind to me. Over the years, Linda had offered small gestures of acknowledgement that no one else bothered with. A knowing look across the room when a board meeting went sideways. A quiet, "be careful," whispered in the break room when she sensed my brother was in a particularly vindictive mood. An occasional check-in that asked how I was doing rather than what I could fix. She remembered my birthday when no one else in the office did. She saved me a seat at company lunches when the table was crowded and my brother's friends had taken all the good spots. She once warned me that a report I had submitted was being rewritten by my father's team before it reached the board, giving me time to prepare for questions I would otherwise have been blindsided by. She did not protect me in any formal sense. She did not advocate for my inclusion or challenge the hierarchy that kept me on the margins. But she did not dismiss me either, in an environment built on exclusion that felt like a bridge. I did not feel alone anymore. That was what made it dangerous. Trust does not always arrive as confidence. Sometimes it comes as the sheer exhaustion of being guarded. After years of measuring every word, calibrating every interaction, watching for signs of manipulation in every conversation, the relief of having someone who seemed safe was overwhelming. Linda never asked for anything. She never tried to use our conversations for her own advantage. She just listened, and in a world where no one listened to me, that felt like a gift. I shared less than I used to, but more with her than with anyone else. Not the grand strategy, not the legal maneuvers, or the documentation I was compiling, but the institutional context, the why behind my moves. I told her about my frustration with the way decisions were made without my input. I explained the patterns I had noticed in the way my work was being marginalized. I confided my suspicion that the vendor contract incident had been deliberate sabotage rather than an honest mistake. I assumed her silence meant discretion. I assumed her neutrality meant safety. At first, the shifts were microscopic, so small, I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. A conversation that cut short when I approached the printer, Linda suddenly finding something urgent on her phone. An answer that skirted the edges of a direct question about a project timeline, her eyes sliding away from mine as she spoke. A lunch invitation. She declined with an excuse that did not quite hold together. Then, information I remembered sharing in strict confidence began to resurface elsewhere. My concerns about the vendor contract appeared in an executive summary, reframed as evidence of my poor communication skills, rather than evidence of sabotage. My observations about departmental inefficiencies were cited in a restructuring proposal, attributed to anonymous feedback, rather than to my name. The narrative was being built piece by piece, and the raw materials were things I had told Linda in moments of exhausted trust. It was not a blatant betrayal yet, it was just a movement where there should have been stasis. The confirmation arrived during a departmental meeting in late October. The conference room was full, the agenda routine, quarterly projections, resource allocation, the usual bureaucratic theater that kept the company feeling productive without actually changing anything. My brother was presenting a risk assessment for a new initiative he had been championing. I had not been consulted on the project, which was typical. What was not typical was the slide that appeared on the shared screen when he advanced to the implementation concerns section. The language was mine. Specific technical terminology I had developed for a restructuring proposal I had drafted months earlier, a document that had been rejected without explanation and supposedly filed away in the archive. My phrasing appeared in a bulleted list of risks being used to justify additional oversight and a reduced timeline. The framing was subtle but unmistakable. The concerns were being attributed to unnamed internal stakeholders who had expressed reservations about leadership capacity. I was the unnamed stakeholder. My own words were being used to undermine my own position. I looked around the room searching for Linda. She was seated near the back, her expression carefully neutral, her eyes fixed on her notepad. She was on the email thread that had circulated the document. I could see her name in the distribution list displayed briefly on the screen before my brother advanced to the next slide. She had received my words repackaged as ammunition, and she had said nothing. She was in that room. And as my work was being dismantled using the very insights I had shared, she said nothing. She did not defend the logic. She did not correct the record. She did not even look uncomfortable. She looked away. I did not confront her after the meeting. I did not pull her aside and demand an explanation. I did not ask how she could sit there and watch my ideas be weaponized against me after everything I had trusted her with. Not because I was afraid of the answer, because silence was the answer. Betrayal does not always announce itself with a knife to the back. Sometimes it is just the quiet withdrawal of support at the exact moment the wind changes direction. Linda had sensed which way the power was flowing, and she had adjusted her position accordingly. She had not set out to hurt me. She had simply decided that her proximity to my father was more valuable than her connection to me. She had chosen the safer path. Silence used at the wrong time is a deliberate decision, and Linda had made hers. What surprised me was not the sting of the loss. I had expected that. I had braced for it somewhere in the back of my mind, even as I let myself believe she was different. What surprised me was the clarity that followed. I had assumed loyalty was about intention, about what people meant to do. I had believed that Linda cared about me and that her caring would translate into support when support was needed. I was learning that in a corporate hierarchy, loyalty is not about intention. It is about exposure. It is about whether someone is willing to stand still when the room leans, even if it puts their own job security at risk. Linda was not willing to stand still. She had 15 years invested in her relationship with my father. She had a pension, a routine, a place in the organizational structure that depended on his continued approval. When forced to choose between defending someone who might lose and protecting her position with someone who might win, she had made the calculation that anyone in her position would make. She did not choose against me. She simply chose herself. The second blow came 2 days later, wrapped in the guise of friendly concern. A colleague from the marketing department, someone I had always considered peripheral but harmless, stopped me in the hallway with a sympathetic expression. "Even Linda thinks you might be going too far." She set her voice low enough to suggest confidentiality, but loud enough to carry to anyone passing by. "I just thought you should know. People are worried about you." The absence of Linda's defense had been translated into a consensus of my guilt. Her silence had been interpreted as agreement with the narrative my brother was constructing. She had not needed to say a word against me. She had simply needed to not say a word for me. Silence had done its work, aligning itself neatly with the path of least resistance. That was when I understood a fundamental truth about these rooms. Neutrality is a myth. Silence is not empty. It fills with whatever narrative has the most momentum. In a family business built on rigid hierarchy, the quietest voice does not stay neutral. It gets co-opted by the loudest one. I stopped expecting backup, not with bitterness, but with a cold, surgical precision. I did not cut ties with Linda or make a scene. I did not confront her or demand an apology or give her the satisfaction of knowing how much her silence had cost me. I simply adjusted the flow of information. I moved everyone to a strict need-to-know basis. My conversations were shortened. My emails became purely transactional, copied to my personal attorney on blind copy, stripped of anything that could be reframed or weaponized. My strategy became an information silo protected by the same walls of silence that had been used against me. I was not punishing anyone. I was simply protecting my future from the frailty of borrowed courage. I had not lost an ally. An ally who stays silent during an ambush was never an ally to begin with. I had simply stopped building my foundation on someone else's hesitation. By the end of the week, the internal dynamic had shifted again. I was not scanning faces for reassurance anymore. I was not measuring silences for hidden meanings. I was not hoping that someone would stand up for me or validate my concerns or tell me I was not alone. The betrayal had not broken my spirit. It had clarified the room. It showed me exactly who could be trusted and who could not. It confirmed what I should have known all along. In this building, I was the only person whose loyalty to myself was guaranteed. From that moment on, I stopped planning for support and started planning for outcomes. After the silence turned on me, I learned the strategic value of brevity. I answered questions directly, finished what needed finishing, and stopped filling in the gaps that were not mine to close. I did not volunteer insights. I did not explain myself into rooms that had already decided how to misinterpret me. I was not waiting to be believed anymore. The quiet felt different this time. It was not heavy. It was precise. I moved through my days without the old reflex to justify my existence, and in that restraint, something steadied. I was alone more often, but I was not spiraling. Detachment, when it comes after crystalline clarity, feels like a promotion. That is when someone unexpected spoke up. It was not a dramatic showdown. It did not happen in a high-stakes board meeting. It occurred during a routine internal controls check-in, one of those practical sessions that the executive team usually skips because they find the details tedious. The room was half full, the tone procedural. I was there because I handled the operations. So was she. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. I had seen her in the hallways for years, always carrying the same worn leather folder, always walking with the unhurried pace of someone who knew her value did not depend on being noticed. She was the company's senior controller, a woman who had been tucked into the back office longer than most of our vice presidents had been in the industry. She had started as a bookkeeper when my grandfather was still running the company, back when the ledgers were physical and the trust between employer and employee meant something different than it did now. To my father and brother, she was just a human calculator, useful but invisible. They greeted her with the same absent nod they gave the cleaning staff. They never asked her opinion on strategy. They never invited her to the dinners where the real decisions were made. They assumed her silence meant she had nothing to say. They forgot that a human calculator has a memory. When a question came up during the meeting, one that brushed up on a financial claim my brother had been repeating without a shred of supporting data, the room tensed in the way rooms do when someone is about to be caught in a lie. My brother had been presenting quarterly projections that showed a 15% improvement in operational efficiency. The numbers looked impressive on the slide. They did not look possible to anyone who understood where the money actually went. Margaret did not argue. She did not raise her voice or look at me for support. She simply opened her folder, the same worn leather one I had seen her carry for years, and stated the numbers. She referenced specific dates, wire transfer identification codes, a reconciliation sequence that did not align with the official narrative. Her voice was calm, almost apologetic, as if she were offering a technical correction rather than exposing a lie. The discrepancy she identified was not small. It was a gap of nearly $2 million between what the board had been told and what the general ledger actually showed. $2 million that had been quietly redirected through a series of intercompany transfers, each one individually unremarkable, collectively damning. No one contradicted her. In a world of egos, you do not argue with the general ledger. My brother tried to recover. He smiled the smile he always used when he needed to buy time, the one that worked on investors and board members who did not know him well enough to see through it. He said something about timing differences and accrual adjustments. Margaret did not respond. She simply placed another page on the table. A summary of the timing differences he had referenced, showing they had already been accounted for in the original reconciliation. It was not dramatic. It was irrefutable. The room shifted in a way I felt in my bones. The attention did not move toward me, but it moved toward reality. The kind of reality that cannot be waved away because it is boring, specific, and uninvested in corporate politics. I did not smile. I did not look at her. I did not need to. Being seen by the right person is better than being applauded by the wrong ones. Later that afternoon, Margaret stopped by my desk. She did not offer congratulations or whisper secrets. She moved with the same unhurried pace, placed a printed transaction log on my desk, and waited for me to look up. I noticed some things over the years that did not tie back to the board's reports, she said, her voice neutral. The patterns were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as clerical errors or system glitches, but they kept repeating, always in the same direction, always benefiting the same accounts. She paused, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that I recognized. The exhaustion of watching wrongdoing and being unable to speak. The frustration of knowing the truth and having no one to tell it to. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "He built something worth protecting. I thought you might need the hard copies for your records." The transaction log she gave me showed the metadata of a ghost account I had been tracking since I found those files in the legacy server. But her records went back further than mine. She had been documenting anomalies for nearly 5 years, long before I had started paying attention. She had been waiting, I realized, for someone who would actually read what she had found. I was not wrong. And I was no longer alone. We did not call it an alliance. We did not make promises or swear loyalty. We compared notes the way professionals do when they care about data integrity more than political outcomes. We checked timelines. We cross-referenced the enterprise system logs with my private ledger. We identified the patterns I had suspected and the ones I had missed. We cleaned up assumptions and replaced speculation with evidence. There was no talk of retaliation, no plotting, just the quiet, methodical work of preparation. I chose not to pull her into the light, not because she asked, but because I understood the corporate risk. She had a pension that depended on this company's continued operation. She had a life inside that system, a routine that had sustained her for decades. Exposing her role would make her a target, and I had seen how this family treated people who became inconvenient. I did not need a shield. I needed a witness. Someone whose records could corroborate mine if the moment ever came to present them. Someone whose decades of credibility could not be easily dismissed as the grievances of a bitter daughter. Before she left my desk that day, Margaret paused at the door. "He used to talk about you," she said. "Your grandfather. He said you were the only one who actually read the documents he gave you. He said that would matter someday." She did not wait for me to respond. She just walked away the same unhurried pace, the same worn leather folder tucked under her arm. By the end of the week, nothing had changed on the surface. The hierarchy held, the routines continued. My brother still walked the hallways with the confidence of someone who believed his position was secure. My father still signed off on reports without reading the details. The board still met and adjourned and congratulated themselves on another quarter of managed expectations. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the foundation. I was not alone anymore. I had a witness. I had corroboration. And I had confirmation that the patterns I had been tracking were not the paranoid imaginings of someone who had been pushed too far. I was still the one holding the fuse. But now I knew exactly where to place it. One person standing up did not change the room. It changed the math. And in business, math is the only thing that eventually matters. The morning of the quarterly board meeting, I woke before my alarm, not from anxiety, but from the strange calm that comes when you have already accepted the ending. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, usually late at night when exhaustion made room for old anger. In those fantasies, I was sharper, louder, and righteous in a way that demanded a standing ovation. But when the actual morning arrived, I felt none of that. I checked my calendar, reviewed my folder one last time, and left the house with the quiet certainty of a woman who already knew how the story would end. The lobby looked the same. Familiarity has a way of dulling drama before it starts. When I stepped into the conference room, conversation slowed only slightly. No one stopped talking. No one acknowledged me beyond a few perfunctory nods. I was there because after my formal email to Human Resources and General Counsel excluding me would have been a documented liability. They chose the easier path, letting me sit in the corner. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, his expression a practiced mask of patriarchal authority. My brother was beside him, leaning forward with the unearned confidence of someone who expected immediate consensus. Across from them sat the people who did not share our last name. Board members, external auditors, and a private equity partner who had flown in from New York. This was not a family brunch. This was a room where fiduciary duties weighed more than blood. The agenda moved quickly. Third quarter updates, market forecasts, and safe metrics that allowed everyone to settle into their roles. I listened without taking notes. I already knew the sequence. When the discussion reached the operational adjustments item, a review framed as routine, but designed to hide the discrepancies I had uncovered, I felt the room shift, not toward me, but away from certainty. I did not interrupt. I waited for that specific pause, the one that comes when an executive assumes their point has landed cleanly. Then I spoke. "I am not here to accuse," I said, my voice steady and neutral. "I am here to provide evidentiary clarification." I slid a thin folder onto the table, not dramatically but just far enough for the lead auditor to reach. Inside were documents that did not need to shout. They did not speculate on intent. They simply aligned dates, versions, and wire transfer identification codes. They showed the entity tunneling I had tracked, displaying the patterns without a single word of commentary. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when attention becomes work. Pages turned. The auditor leaned in. The private equity partner put down his pen. No one looked at me. They did not need to. I was not the point anymore. The audit trail was. The questions that followed were not the kind my father and brother were used to deflecting. They were precise, technical, and dangerous. Who authorized this specific revision to the liability clause? Why was the vendor payment diverted to this non-disclosed subsidiary? Where is the board resolution for this transfer of authority? I watched my father adjust his phrasing, circling facts without ever landing on them. I watched my brother attempt to speak with a confidence that now looked like a desperate performance. I did not intervene. I did not help. For once, the room did not need me to smooth over their incompetence. As the discussion unfolded, something shifted. I was not being evaluated. They were. The external advisors, sensing a potential regulatory filing issue, immediately called for an independent forensic audit. The board members, suddenly aware of their own personal liability, began to distance themselves from my father's instincts. And then the general counsel cleared his throat. "There is one more matter," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Regarding the family trust and voting control of the primary shares." My father's face went pale. My brother stopped fidgeting. The counsel continued. "According to the terms established in the 2018 Restructuring Section 14, voting control transfers automatically upon certain conditions being met. Those conditions were satisfied last month when the trust acknowledgement was signed. The current holder of voting control is not who this board has been operating under the assumption of." He looked directly at me. The majority voting rights now belong to her. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched my father's jaw tighten. I watched my brother's eyes dart around the room, looking for someone to contradict the statement. No one did. I sat still, hands folded. I felt a profound sense of release. I did not feel powerful. I felt finished. I was done explaining, done absorbing doubt that was not mine, and done wondering if the truth would hold if I stepped back. It did. When the meeting adjourned, there was no dramatic confrontation. People gathered their things quietly, avoiding eye contact with the men at the head of the table. My father did not look at me as he left. My brother said nothing. They did not need to. The record had already done what I never could. The first call came 2 hours after the board meeting ended. It was my mother. Her voice carried that specific blend of warmth and urgency she always used when the family needed me to be reasonable. The tone that meant someone had asked her to smooth things over, to be the bridge between conflict and resolution, the way she had been doing for my father, their entire marriage. She did not mention the meeting directly. She talked about dinner, about how long it had been since we had all sat together as a family, about how important it was to communicate face-to-face during difficult times. She mentioned my grandmother's lasagna recipe, the one she only made for special occasions. She mentioned how much my father had been working lately, how tired he seemed, how much pressure he was under. She did not mention the $14 million. She did not mention the entity tunneling or the unauthorized transfers or the decades of systematic exclusion. She talked about family, about togetherness, about moving forward. I listened without interrupting. I had learned long ago that interrupting my mother only prolonged the conversation. She needed to say her piece to fulfill whatever role had been assigned to her in the family's damage control strategy. When she finished, I told her I would think about it. Then I hung up. I did not cry. I did not feel the anger I had expected to feel. I felt something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of realizing that even now, after everything that had happened in that boardroom, my mother's first instinct was to protect my father, to smooth over, to pretend that a family dinner could heal wounds that had been inflicted deliberately, systematically, over the course of my entire adult life. The second call came from my brother. His tone was different, clipped, professional, as if we were colleagues instead of siblings, as if the last 30 years of shared history could be set aside like an inconvenient contract clause. He wanted to discuss options, he said. He used words like transition and cooperation and mutual benefit. He talked about the importance of stability during periods of organizational change. He referenced shareholder confidence and market perception and the fiduciary responsibilities we both shared as members of the family trust. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the years of exclusion or the sabotage or the closed doors. He did not mention the presentation he had stolen from me or the credit he had taken for my work or the countless times he had looked through me as if I were furniture. He simply wanted to know what it would take to keep things running smoothly. What it would take, I realized, to make me go away quietly. I told him I would need that request in writing. A formal proposal outlining whatever transition he had in mind with specific terms and timelines. I wanted documentation. I wanted everything on the record. He hung up without saying goodbye. I had expected that. My brother had never been good at situations where he was not in control. He had never had to be. By evening, my father had sent an email. It was brief and formal, the kind of correspondence you send to a business partner you do not particularly like, but cannot afford to alienate. No salutation, no pleasantries, just a single paragraph proposing a meeting, just the two of us, to discuss the path forward. I read the email 3 times. I noticed the careful phrasing, the path forward. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a path forward, as if the past were a detour we could simply drive around. I did not respond immediately. I let the email sit in my inbox overnight, the way I had let their silence sit in mine for years, the way they had let my contributions go, unacknowledged, my insights go unheard, my presence go unnoticed. They could wait. For once, they could experience what it felt like to send a message into the void and wonder if anyone was listening. The meeting took place in his office the following afternoon, the same office where I had signed the trust documents a month earlier without fully understanding what they meant. The same office where I had been handed papers and told to sign without being asked for my thoughts or my input or my perspective. The room looked different now. Or perhaps I was seeing it clearly for the first time. The photographs on the wall behind his desk showed my father with politicians, with business leaders, with celebrities I vaguely recognized from magazine covers. There was a photograph of him with my brother at some charity gala, both of them in tuxedos, both of them smiling, the confident smiles of men who had never been told they did not belong. There were no photographs of me, not on the wall, not on his desk, not anywhere in the room where he had spent the last 30 years building an empire on the labor of people he refused to see. He was already seated when I arrived. His posture was different now, less expensive, more contained. He did not stand to greet me. He did not offer the performative warmth he usually reserved for clients and investors. He simply gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I had sat as a child, waiting to be dismissed. I sat down without waiting for an invitation. I did not need his permission anymore. "I am not going to pretend this is how I wanted things to go," he said. His voice was measured, careful, each word chosen with the precision of a man who knew he was being recorded even when he was not. But we are where we are, and I think we both know that a public conflict helps no one. I did not respond. I let the silence stretch between us, filling the space where his authority used to live. He shifted in his chair. The silence was uncomfortable for him. He had spent his entire career filling silences, dominating conversations, steering discussions toward conclusions he had already determined. Silence was not a tool he knew how to use. It was a weapon being used against him. He continued, unable to bear the quiet. "What do you want?" "A seat on the board." "An executive title." "We can arrange that. We can restructure the leadership team to include you in a more visible capacity. There is no need for this to become adversarial." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness, of reasonableness, of a father offering his daughter a gift she should be grateful to receive. He was offering me a place at his table, a seat he controlled, a title he could revoke, a visibility that depended entirely on his continued goodwill. I looked at him for a long moment. This was the conversation I had imagined for years, the one where he finally acknowledged that I belonged in the room, the one where he finally saw me as someone worth negotiating with instead of someone to be managed and dismissed. But now that it was happening, I realized something had changed. I was no longer hungry for his approval. The need that had driven me for decades, the desperate hope that someday he would see my value, had finally exhausted itself. I did not want his recognition anymore. I did not want his respect. I did not even want his apology, because an apology extracted under duress would mean nothing. I was simply clear. "I do not want a seat you give me because you have no other choice," I said. My voice was steady, calm, the voice of someone who had already decided and was simply informing him of the outcome. "I want the corporate records corrected to reflect the reality of the transactions. I want my voting rights formally acknowledged in the next board filing. And I want a governance structure that makes the kind of manipulation I uncovered impossible going forward." He blinked. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw something I had never seen on his face before. Surprise. Genuine surprise. He had expected me to negotiate for a title, for money, for the symbols of status that he understood and valued. He had not expected me to ask for something he could not give me without fundamentally changing the way he operated. "You are talking about a complete overhaul," he said. His voice had an edge now, the frustration of a man who was not getting the conversation he had prepared for. "I am talking about transparency," I replied. "Something this company has avoided for as long as I can remember." The negotiation that followed was not pleasant. He pushed back on every point. He tried to minimize the significance of the discrepancies I had found, calling them accounting irregularities that any company of our size would have. He suggested that I was overreacting to standard business practices, that I did not understand the complexity of managing cash flow across multiple subsidiaries. He implied that my lack of formal leadership experience made me unqualified to demand structural changes to an organization I had never actually run. He tried guilt. He mentioned my mother, how worried she had been, how much stress this was causing her. He mentioned to my grandmother how disappointed she would be to see the family fighting like this. He mentioned the employees, the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on the company's stability, and how irresponsible it would be to destabilize leadership during a critical growth period. He tried intimidation. He reminded me that he still had allies on the board, that voting rights were not the same as operational control, that running a company required relationships I had not built and expertise I had not developed, that I could win this battle and still lose the war. I let him talk. I let him cycle through every argument, every manipulation, every tactic he had used successfully for 30 years. And when he was finished, when he had emptied his arsenal and sat back in his chair with the expectant look of a man who believed his points had landed, I responded, "I have copies of every document I said, every timestamp, every revision, every wire transfer authorization with signatures that do not match the board resolutions they were supposed to be based on. The external auditors are already preparing their independent report. The board members have begun asking questions you cannot answer, and the private equity partner who flew in from New York has made it very clear that his firm's continued investment depends on governance reforms that you are not in a position to block." I paused, letting the words settle. "You can fight me on this," I continued. "You can try to delay and obstruct and hope that I get tired or distracted, or decide that family peace is more important than institutional accountability. But I have been waiting for this moment for longer than you know. I am not tired. I am not distracted. And I learned a long time ago that peace built on my silence is not peace at all." He went quiet. The bluster drained from his face, replaced by something I had never seen there before: recognition. The recognition of a man who had finally met an opponent he could not dismiss or diminish or simply wait out. When I left his office that evening, nothing had been finalized, no documents had been signed, no agreements had been reached. The details would take weeks to negotiate, months to implement, years to fully realize. But the balance had shifted. He was no longer the one setting the terms. He was no longer the one deciding who belonged in the room and who would be sent to check on the coffee. And for the first time in 30 years, he knew it. Winning did not feel like a triumph. It felt like silence. Not the empty kind, but the steady, grounded quiet that allows you to hear your own breathing. In the days that followed the board meeting, the resistance in the office did not vanish. It recalibrated. Conversations no longer stopped when I entered the room. They slowed down to include me. People listened to the end of my sentences. No one interrupted to summarize my thoughts or redirect the discussion before I could finish making my point. It was not warm, it was strategic caution, and that was more than enough. The power shift was invisible, but absolute. My father spoke more carefully now, every word seemingly passing through a legal filter before leaving his mouth. He reviewed documents before signing them. He asked clarifying questions in meetings instead of waving his hand and trusting his instincts. He did not challenge me, but he did not apologize either. The silence between us had taken on a different texture. It was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of someone waiting to see what I would do next. My brother stopped leaning back in his chair with that air of inevitable victory. The casual confidence that had defined his presence in every room had been replaced by something more cautious, more watchful. He began asking me questions, real ones, the kind you ask when you realize your survival depends on someone else's competence and goodwill. He wanted to know my thoughts on vendor contracts. He asked for my input on staffing decisions. He copied me on emails he would have hidden from me a month earlier. I noticed it all, and for the first time, I was not reacting to it. I was observing it from the center of the storm. With that awareness came a question I had not expected. What did power actually taste like? I had spent years imagining it as a weapon, a tool sharp enough to cut away the dismissal, the erasures, and the way my work had been absorbed into my brother's reputation. I had fantasized about the moment when I would finally have leverage, when they would finally have to listen, when the balance would shift, and I would be the one deciding who belonged in the room. Now that the leverage was mine, now that I held the majority voting rights through the legacy trust, it did not demand to be used. It simply waited, patient, available, ready to be deployed in whatever direction I chose. The suggestion for a cleanup came 3 days after the board meeting. A consultant named Howard Price, a man the company had retained for years to handle delicate organizational transitions, requested a private meeting. He spoke in the careful euphemisms that consultants use when they want to propose something ugly without leaving fingerprints. He referenced organizational optimization, streamlining leadership for the next phase of growth, eliminating legacy roles that no longer provided a positive return on investment. He had prepared a list neatly typed of positions that could be restructured. My father's name was at the top. My brother was second. The implication was clear. I had the green light to remove them. The board would support it. The shareholders would applaud the decisive leadership. Many of the directors, Howard explained, would be relieved to see the dead weight gone. They had been nervous about the family's grip on the company for years. This was an opportunity to professionalize, to modernize, to break free from the dysfunction that had been dragging down performance. He slid the paper across the table toward me and waited for my response. I did not answer right away. I told him I needed time to understand the shape of the choice. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about what it would mean to say yes. I imagined my father clearing out his office the same way he had once imagined me clearing out mine. I imagined my brother receiving the news, the shock on his face, the sudden understanding that the ground he had always taken for granted had finally given way beneath him. I imagined the satisfaction of watching them experience for the first time the uncertainty and helplessness they had inflicted on me for years. The fantasy was vivid, it was detailed, and it left me feeling empty. I thought about my mother. She had called twice since the board meeting, her voice tight with anxiety, asking questions she did not really want answered. She had spent her entire marriage managing my father's ego and smoothing over his conflicts. If I removed him from the company, I would be removing the foundation of her identity as well. She had never protected me from his cruelty, but she had also never been given the tools to protect herself. Destroying him would destroy her too in ways she might never recover from. I thought about the employees who had worked under my father and brother for decades, the assistants who had learned to navigate their moods, the managers who had built careers around their expectations. A purge at the top would ripple downward in ways I could not fully predict. Some would be relieved, others would be terrified. All of them would be watching to see what kind of leader I intended to be. I thought about the version of myself who had stood outside that closed door holding folders no one wanted to see. I remembered the sound of their voices continuing without me, the casual cruelty of being dismissed so completely that they did not even lower their voices. I had fought this hard. I had documented and prepared and waited and endured. But I had not done all of that just to become a louder, colder version of them. I had not survived their kind of power just to wield it the same way. The decision when it came was not dramatic. It arrived quietly the way most important decisions do. The next morning I met with Howard Price again. I thanked him for his analysis and declined the suggestion of a purge. I told him I was not interested in retaliation disguised as restructuring. I would not use my position to settle personal scores no matter how justified those scores might be. Instead, I demanded radical transparency. We would move forward by clarifying roles based on performance data, not by eliminating people for past behavior that the old system had rewarded. Everyone, including my father and brother, would be evaluated by the same metrics. Everyone would be held to the same standards. If they could not meet those standards, the consequences would follow naturally. but I would not manufacture their failure. I would simply stop protecting them from it. Howard looked at me for a long moment. I could see him recalculating, adjusting his assumptions about what kind of person I was and what kind of leader I intended to be. "The board will be surprised," he said finally. "Good," I replied. "They should be." The board meeting where I announced my decision was tense in a way I had not anticipated. The directors had prepared themselves for a different kind of conversation. They had expected demands, ultimatums, the satisfaction of watching a wronged daughter claim her pound of flesh. Instead, I gave them a governance structure, new oversight committees, clear reporting lines, performance metrics that applied equally to family members and outside hires, a framework that made the old patterns of manipulation impossible to sustain. The relief in the room was palpable. They had expected a predator. I gave them a process. My father sat at the far end of the table, his face unreadable. My brother fidgeted with his pen, unable to meet my eyes. Neither of them spoke during the presentation. Neither of them objected to the new requirements. They had lost the standing to object to anything. After the meeting, my mother called. Her voice was softer than it had been in weeks, the anxiety replaced by something closer to confusion. "I thought you would make them pay," she said. "After everything they did to you." "I am making them accountable," I replied. "That is not the same thing as making them pay." She was quiet for a long moment. "I do not understand you," she said finally. "I do not understand how you can let it go." "I am not letting it go," I said. "I am letting it be what it is. They did what they did. Now they have to live with the consequences. But I do not have to become them to make that happen." Mercy, as I practiced it, was not about forgiveness. It was not about reconciliation or healing or pretending the past had not happened. It was about identity. It was choosing not to destroy when destruction would have been easy. I did not owe them absolution, and I did not offer it. What I offered was an environment where their old patterns of manipulation could no longer hide, where competence mattered more than confidence, where the truth could not be buried in a drawer no one thought to check. The real shift was internal. I stopped stepping in to fix my brother's sloppy mistakes. When he submitted projections that did not add up, I let the finance team send them back with questions. I stopped smoothing over my father's friction with partners. When he offended a major investor with his dismissive tone, I let the relationship cool without intervening. When they made decisions without my input, I let the consequences land exactly where they belonged. This was not revenge. It was an alignment of responsibility. I did not punish them. I simply stopped protecting them. The change unsettled them more than any confrontation could have. My brother came to my office twice in the first week, asking for help with problems he had always assumed I would solve without being asked. I listened to his explanations. I asked clarifying questions, and then I told him I was confident he could handle it himself. The look on his face was almost worth the years of invisibility. Almost. My father tried a different approach. He attempted to pull me back into the old patterns through family obligation. He mentioned my mother's anxiety. He referenced upcoming holidays. He suggested that professional disagreements did not need to affect personal relationships. I told him I agreed. Professional disagreements and personal relationships were separate matters, and I intended to keep them that way. Boundaries, I was learning, do not require a paragraph of justification. They do not require explanations or apologies or negotiations. They only require a firm no, and the willingness to repeat it as many times as necessary. By the end of the month, the new structure had begun to take hold. Meetings ran differently. Decisions were documented. Accountability was no longer optional. The company I had inherited was not transformed overnight. Change does not work that way. But for the first time in its history, the rules applied to everyone equally. For the first time, the people at the top could not exempt themselves from the standards they imposed on everyone else. I had chosen not to take everything I could have taken, not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, because I had finally understood that the most powerful thing I could do was not to destroy them. It was to outlast them, on my own terms, in my own way. And that was exactly what I intended to do. The company moved forward, Not necessarily kinder, but infinitely clearer. Ownership was visible. Mistakes were documented. And for the first time, the work I did was recognized as mine, not because I demanded it, but because I had removed the camouflage of my own making. The forensic audit took 3 months to complete. During those months, I learned what it meant to wait without anxiety. The auditors worked through the files I had compiled, cross-referencing my documentation with Margaret's records and the official corporate ledgers. They interviewed department heads and reviewed authorization chains. They traced wire transfers through the labyrinth of subsidiaries my father and brother had constructed over the years. I did not hover. I did not ask for updates. I simply continued my work and let the numbers speak for themselves. When the final report was delivered to the board, the room was quieter than I had ever seen it. The lead auditor, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who had spent 30 years untangling corporate fraud, presented her findings with the same neutral tone Margaret had used months earlier. The entity tunneling I had suspected was confirmed. The unauthorized transfers were documented in precise detail. The systematic exclusion of oversight was laid bare in a timeline that stretched back nearly a decade. The total amount diverted from the company exceeded $14 million. Not enough to destroy the business, but enough to fund my brother's lifestyle, my father's political donations, and a network of consulting fees that went to companies owned by relatives who had never consulted on anything. The numbers were precise and damning. No one in the room attempted to defend them. My father stepped down as chief executive officer the following quarter. The announcement was framed as a planned transition, a graceful handoff to the next generation of leadership. The press release mentioned his decades of service and his confidence in the company's future direction. No one outside the board knew the truth. No one needed to. The record existed. That was enough. I watched him clean out his office on a Thursday afternoon. He moved slowly, placing photographs and awards into cardboard boxes, with the careful movements of someone who had not expected to be doing this for another 10 years. He did not look at me when I passed in the hallway. I did not stop to offer condolences or gloat. There was nothing left to say between us that the documents had not already said. My brother remained in the company, but in a reduced capacity. His title changed from Executive Vice President of Strategic Development to Director of Special Projects, a role that sounded important but carried no direct reports and no budget authority. He reported to a committee now, instead of operating as a unilateral decision-maker. Every expenditure required 3 signatures. Every strategic recommendation required supporting documentation. The adjustment was difficult for him. I watched him struggle with the new structure during meetings, his jaw tightening when someone questioned his assumptions, his hands clenching when a junior analyst asked for the data behind his projections. He had spent his entire career operating on confidence and family name. The new system required competence and accountability. These were currencies he had never needed to accumulate. I could have gloated. I did not. There was no satisfaction in watching someone realize they had been living on borrowed credibility. There was only the quiet recognition that the system had finally corrected itself, and that correction had cost him something he could never earn back. Margaret Sullivan retired at the end of the fiscal year. Her departure was announced in a company-wide email that thanked her for her decades of dedicated service and wished her well in her future endeavors. Most people deleted the email without reading past the first line. I printed it and kept it in my desk drawer. The week before she left, I asked her to lunch. We went to a small restaurant near the office, the kind of place where the portions were generous and no one recognized us. We did not talk about the audit or the transition or the family. We talked about her plans for retirement, a house in Vermont, grandchildren she had been too busy to visit, books she had been meaning to read for years. When we finished, I walked her back to the office. At the entrance, she stopped and looked at me with the same steady gaze she had given me when she placed that first transaction log on my desk. "You did the right thing," she said. "Not the easy thing. The right thing. There is a difference." I wrote her a letter after she left. I did not mention the specifics of what she had done or the role she had played in the audit. I simply told her that her work had mattered even when no one was watching, that her integrity had made a difference, that I would not forget. She sent back a short note on plain white paper, her handwriting neat and deliberate. It said only 2 words. I know. The private equity partner from New York, a man named David Chen, who had flown in for that fateful board meeting, became a regular presence at our quarterly reviews. He was impressed, he told me once over coffee, by the way I had handled the transition. He said most people in my position would have burned the house down, scorched earth, public humiliation, criminal referrals. I told him I had considered it. There were nights in the months after the board meeting when I had imagined exactly how satisfying it would be to watch my father's name dragged through the financial press, to see my brother's face on the cover of a magazine with words like fraud and mismanagement underneath. But I preferred to own the house. Instead, I said, burning it down would have destroyed the company my grandfather built. It would have cost jobs. It would have validated every assumption my father had ever made about women being too emotional to lead. David nodded slowly. He understood. In his world, restraint was its own form of power. The ability to destroy something and choose not to was more impressive than the destruction itself. The governance reforms took nearly a year to implement. New oversight committees with independent members who had no family connections. New reporting requirements that made it impossible to hide transfers between subsidiaries. New protections for employees who raised concerns about financial irregularities, including a confidential hotline, and guaranteed legal support for whistleblowers. The company was not perfect. No company is. But it was no longer built on the assumption that the people at the top were beyond accountability. That assumption had cost us $14 million and decades of institutional trust. Rebuilding would take time. But at least now we were building on solid ground. I did not become the chief executive officer. The board offered me the position 3 times in the year following my father's departure. Each time I declined. The role came with too much of the old baggage, too many expectations shaped by the men who had held it before me. I did not want to spend my days defending decisions in the same office where I had been told I did not belong. I did not want to inherit a title that had been used as a weapon against me. Instead, I took a position on the board and established an investment fund focused on operational efficiency in family-owned businesses. The fund was built on everything I had learned in my years of being invisible. I knew how to identify the hidden dependencies that kept companies running. I knew how to spot the employees who did the real work and the executives who took the credit. I knew how to read the fine print and find the clauses that others had overlooked. The fund was successful. Within 2 years, we had invested in 12 companies and helped restructure 6 others. Our returns exceeded market average by 8%. Financial publications wrote profiles about our approach. Other investors asked for meetings. More importantly, it was mine. Every decision, every investment, every success and failure. I had built something that did not depend on my family's name or my father's approval. I had proven to myself more than anyone else that my value had never been the problem. Their blindness had been the problem, and I was done compensating for it. My relationship with my family did not heal in any traditional sense. We did not have tearful reconciliations over holiday dinners or heartfelt conversations about the past. The wounds were too deep and too deliberately inflicted for that kind of repair. What we had instead were boundaries, clear, firm, and non-negotiable. My father and I spoke occasionally, usually about business matters that required his historical knowledge of old contracts or partner relationships. He was civil. I was professional. We did not discuss the audit or his departure or the years of dismissal that had preceded it. There was nothing to discuss. The facts were what they were. My brother and I maintained a professional distance. We sat in the same board meetings and reviewed the same quarterly reports. We nodded at each other in hallways and exchanged the minimum courtesies required by corporate decorum. We did not pretend to be friends. We did not pretend the past had not happened. We simply coexisted in a structure that no longer allowed him to diminish me. My mother still calls sometimes. Sunday evenings, usually when she was alone in the house and missing the family dinners that had once gathered us all together. She still hoped for reconciliation. She still believed that time would soften the edges and bring us back to something resembling closeness. I attended when I could. I left when I needed to. I no longer felt obligated to perform the role of the dutiful daughter who absorbed everyone else's discomfort to keep the peace. That performance had cost me too much. I was done paying the price for their inability to see me clearly. The inheritance I had claimed was not just financial. It was not just the voting rights, or the board position, or the investment fund that bore my name. It was the right to define my own role, my own value, my own future. For years I had been told where I belonged. I had been placed in corners and excluded from rooms and handed work that others would take credit for. Now I decided for myself where I went, what I built, who I allowed into my life, and under what terms. That was the inheritance my grandfather had given me, not just a clause in a trust document, a permission I had never realized I needed, the permission to stop waiting for approval that would never come and start building something that did not require it. Nothing dramatic happened after that, and that is how I knew it was over. The days settled into a rhythm so ordinary it would have been disappointing if I had still been expecting fireworks. Meetings started and ended on time. Decisions were made without raised voices. The company moved forward the way it always claimed it wanted to, quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. My family did not pressure me anymore, but they did not move closer either. There was no sudden warmth, no cinematic healing, just space. And for the first time, that space did not feel like a vacuum. It felt like a boundary. The biggest change showed up in the smallest moments. When a deadline slipped in the logistics department, my phone did not ring. No one assumed I would stay until midnight to fix a mess I did not create. I did my part. No more, no less. I offered insight when the board requested it, but I stopped anticipating needs that were not voiced. The reflex to rescue, to quietly absorb the consequences of my brother's or father's choices, faded like a muscle finally allowed to rest. I was not the family safety net anymore, and without that net, they had to learn how to land on their own. At first, the absence felt strange. I had spent decades measuring my value by how indispensable I could be. It took time to understand that I was not withdrawing out of spite. I was stepping into proportion. For so long, my labor had been oversized compared to my authority. Now, with my voting rights secured, the balance had corrected itself. I did not need to announce the shift. It announced itself every time I chose not to intervene. I no longer waited for an apology that would explain the years of dismissal. I released the fantasy of having the past rewritten. Closure, I realized, is not something other people grant you. It is a decision you make when you realize the other party is no longer required for your participation in the future. One afternoon, a younger employee stopped by my office. She hesitated in the doorway the way I used to, uncertain of her own footing. After we finished discussing a project, she asked almost in a whisper, "How did you learn to stand your ground?" I did not tell her about the metadata, the hidden trust clauses, or the cold hallway. I just said, "I stopped waiting to be chosen." She nodded, and in that look, I saw the cycles start to break. Success, I realized, had nothing to do with making my father regret his choices or making my brother feel small. It was not about dominance. Winning was about independence. Knowing that my sense of self was no longer a variable in their equation. The final act was almost anticlimactic. I signed off on the formal restructuring plan, a document that clarified departmental boundaries and made my old vague role of administrative support obsolete. It replaced favors with protocols. When I finished, I closed the folder and stood up. The hallway outside was quiet. I walked past the boardroom, the space I had once been told I did not belong. This time, no one blocked my way. But the strange thing was, I did not feel the urge to go inside. I had spent so long trying to get a seat at their table, only to realize I had already built a better one of my own. They raised me to stay quiet. I taught myself when to leave. I did not lose my family. I outgrew the role they designed for me. The story did not end with them finally understanding me. It ended with me finally understanding myself. The door that once closed in my face no longer mattered, because I had learned something they never expected me to learn. The most powerful thing you can do is not fight for a place at someone else's table. It is knowing when to build your own. And I did. If you've ever felt invisible in the very place you belong, remember this: your value does not depend on whether others choose to see it. If this story feels familiar, you're not alone. Feel free to share your own experience